Okay, we're back again. I think I got it this time. Hopefully. Let me check because last time I thought I just checked to see if it was running. It was. I didn't check the audio when I switched my audio thing, and there was like a double voice throughout the entire latter half of the video. So I'm very sorry about that. So this time I'm going to actually listen to it a bit and send a link to those who I know. Let's see. Okay, audio sounds good. Checking the sound.
Among the various consequences that follow from what has been said.
Yes. I think we on here. It's delayed like good 15, 20 seconds, but we out here, y'all. So I got new gear thanks to a new job. If you listen to my podcast, you know what's going on with that. So check out my podcast. Um, Finally up and running. Okay. Hopefully some folks drop by for my Discord group. And we'll get started. Okay, so we are good to go now. Gonna jump right into it. So if we recall our last episode, we was on talking about what was he talking about? Language and the kind of like the subject, kind of going that full circle thing, and how you start with an anchor point of a subject of an idea, and then as you talk about it, as you discuss it, you give it meaning. Once you go through that. So gonna leave off from there, I guess. Maybe one day I should do like a look back at the last episode, but it's hard to find the last episode unless I'm not sure if I saved it. No, I did not. Oh well, whatever. We just start from here. Let's go.
Said, this one in particular can be various.
Sorry.
Among the various consequences that follow from what has been said, this one in particular can be stressed that knowledge is only actual and can only be expounded as science or as system. And furthermore, that a so-called basic proposition or principle of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle. It is therefore easy to refute it. The refutation consists in pointing out its defect, and it is defective because it is only the universal or principle, it is only the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, it is derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter-assertions and random thoughts from the outside.
Let me just back up because gotta slow down at first. Make sure I'm understanding what's going on here, what's being said. Among the various consequences that follow from what has just been said, this one in particular can be stressed that knowledge is only actual and can only be expounded as science or as system. I think that's powerful. And I believe, if I recall, it probably would be just easier to just look back at the last couple seconds of the last video, but um, following from what has just been said, what he's talking about, like, infusing knowledge with meaning as you talk about it, right? As you go through the process of trying to understand something. And I really like this here. Knowledge is only actual and can only be expounded as science or as system, right? And science is, of course, a process of understanding something, of going through a process of testing it and making predictions and all this other stuff. And a system is a how do you define system without saying systematic? it's a building blocks of sorts, right? And where every part of this I idea that you're trying this knowledge, this theory of a piece of information, works together, kind of like an ecosystem. Or that's still the use using the word system here, but you get it. And furthermore, that a so-called basic proposition or principle of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle. Hmm. A so-called basic proposition of principle of philosophy or principle of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle. Interesting. Yeah. Supposedly means like because the principle is like a template almost, right? It's like, oh yeah, it applies in some situations, or this is the general understanding of how this might work, but that's not the understanding. That's not the total thing, and so therefore, um, it is part of the falsehood of it, right? It's kind of false in that it's not able to tell the whole truth. Um, and again, I think this circles back to the whole preface, right? Where he's saying you can't, make a preface for a philosophical text because in trying to preface it and trying to overview it, you're not even giving the whole thing. You're not giving what it is, which is why he's doing this type of preface, which is more of a, introduction into how to think about philosophy, which is a pretty interesting little smarmy little workaround. Smarmy, I don't know if
It
that's
is
a
therefore easy to refute.
yeah, easy to refute. Refutation consists in pointing out its defect. Yeah, you just have to point out that that's not real, whatever, because it is only the universal principles on the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, it is derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter assertions and random thoughts from outside. That's another point too, right? People love to do this, where instead of refuting you exactly, right, they go, "Oh, what about this and what about that?" Right? People might call it whataboutism, but in general, it's just bad thought, right? It's just bad way of understanding it. The only places I see this kind of relevant, where you're kind of going outside, is when the argument itself is so broad, it's too broad, right? And I'm gonna be contentious here, but the whole pro-life argument, right? When you say pro-life or pro-choice, like that's a false argument there, because pro-choice has nothing to do with pro-life. Pro-life is just going outside of the argument of pro-choice, and so therefore, when you say you're pro-life, you open yourself up to, oh, what about this? What about animals? What about insects? What about humans when they're the quality of life and all this other stuff? It's just inherently too broad of a subject of an idea, um, versus when you have a significant principle that's defined as saying, okay, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Then, in order to really refute it, you have to use that principle in and of itself, as opposed to going outside of that
Refute
thing.
it. The refutation consists in pointing out its defect, and it is defective because it is only the universal or principle, it is only the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, it is derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter assertions and random thoughts from the outside. The refutation would therefore properly consist in the further development of the principle, and in thus remedying the defectiveness if it did not mistakenly pay attention solely to its negative action, without awareness of its progress and result on their positive side too. The genuinely positive exposition of the beginning is thus also conversely just as much a negative attitude towards it, that is, towards its initially one-sided form of being immediate or purpose. It can therefore be taken equally well as a refutation of the principle that constitutes the basis of the system, but it is more correct to regard it as a demonstration that the basis or principle of the system is, in fact,
Only the beginning.
only its beginning.
It's just the basics, man. You can't use the basics to
In
describe
24,
the entire system or the entirety of an idea or subject. You have to say, okay, yeah, we start here and then we build on that. Have those building blocks and such like that.
Hegel is saying that knowledge only becomes actual when science, remember, Wissenschaft, disciplinary knowledge, structured knowledge, becomes system. And he says that this is one of the consequences that follows from what's been said. He wants to stress this, and he says, furthermore, so-called basic propositions or principles of philosophy, if true, are also false. They're true and they're
That's what
false
we're saying.
at the same time. Now that's an interesting thing to say, and that requires some mulling over. What could he mean by that? You know, one possibility would be to say, well, they're true in one sense, but false in another sense. Or maybe they're true in that they're true at a given point in time, but they cease being true later on. They become false because what they're talking about has changed. But would that work for philosophy? Well, I suppose it would work for some things. Like if human nature changes over time and your propositions are about human nature. What about
Or if you just fundamentally misunderstand human nature. This is something that I'm not. I don't know if Hegel, does this, but I know many other philosophers of that time fundamentally misunderstood human nature. They assumed that human nature, in their location, right, in their geography, in their empires, in their European cities and states and such as that, was the same human nature that can be found anywhere around the world, right? It's a gross assumption of that. And in fact, you see this when they come across other cultures, especially in with the Native Americans. Um, and I recently heard about, I think I mentioned this before in one of the past episodes of Kondarunk, I believe his name was, who was a famous Native American from I forget which peoples, but he came over to Europe and was basically debating people about their way of life. He was saying your entire way of life is completely ridiculous, and all this other stuff. And a lot of people got a lot of the sources of the Enlightenment came from the critiques of Kondarok and other Native Americans that they had against European culture because they looked at the hierarchical structures they had, and it's like Native Americans were like, "What is that? That's stupid. That's terrible. You live like slaves and this, that, and the other." um, the use of currency, the use of kind of following orders without design, the idea of having liberty or freedom without actual freedom, because of being limited by laws and things like that. They had all these critiques, right? And much of the Enlightenment was based on those critiques. And today, our understandings of like liberty, of freedom, is more reminiscent of the Native Americans' ideas of freedom than the early, European ideas of freedom. And that to me just is really interesting. But I say all that because if our ideas of human nature is a certain way, then later on, or if you get exposed to other people's, right? Then it turns out your principles, your ideas of what your philosophy of life was wrong.
physical
That's always good to keep
reality?
in mind.
That's a problem there. What about logic? Do the laws of logic change over time? From place to place. Is Pascal right? Is truth on one side of the Pyrenees, falsity on the other?
Hmm.
It's not so much that he's talking about. He's talking about something a bit deeper. Hegel says, as a basic proposition or as a principle, it's true, but it's also false. It's assailable precisely because it is a basic proposition. And here you might say, well, what the hell are we supposed to build our philosophical systems out of if not basic propositions? And Hegel would say, yeah, precisely. The question isn't whether you build on them or build from them. It's how you build and how you understand the process of building, of integration. So he says, it's very easy to refute a principle because it's just a principle. The refutation consists in pointing out its defect. And it's defective because it is only the universal or principle. It is only the beginning. So there's all sorts of principles where somebody will begin their philosophy with that, and somebody will come along and say, whoa, 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 I've got a counterexample, or, the word that they love these days, I've got a defeater for you. And
Never heard of
Hegel
that.
would say, and here he'd be like Aristotle, again, you notice I keep bringing up Aristotle because Hegel is drawing a lot from him. He would say, there are going to be exceptions. So you're really being silly if you think that you're going to refute a basic principle that we're using to work out something more extensive by saying, I've got an objection to it. And Hegel says the objections generally come in two different sorts. They're a counter-assertion coming in from the outside, usually from somebody else's system. I don't accept your beginning points. And then you say, well, what beginning points do you have? And their beginning points turn out to be something completely arbitrary, or something that only makes sense within their system. This is the case actually for a lot of people who criticize Hegel. Well, Popper said about Hegel X, Y, Z. Well, maybe Popper's right, but wouldn't you need to read the Hegel first to figure that out? Maybe you shouldn't just come in from the outside and criticize. Maybe you actually have to explore from within. He also talks about random thoughts. People just come up with random stuff, I just don't accept that. It's, they can be stubborn about it. This doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't grip my feelings. And then you say, well, we're doing philosophy here. It's not just about whether it feels good to you or something like that. And then you can come up with other random thoughts as well. So Hegel says, if you really want to refute a basic proposition or principle, what you have to do is use it to refute itself. If the refutation is thorough, it's derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter-assertions and random thoughts coming in from the outside. The refutation would therefore properly consist in the further development of the principle. And that development is not just going to be, this process of becoming other that we've talked about, mediation. It's also going to be when you put it together with the other principles and you weave them together into a system.
Weave them.
It's from the perspective of the system that you can say, wow, this basic principle actually needs to be rethought. Or we might have to get rid of this altogether. This may actually have been a good starting point, but turns out that we didn't really need it. What would be an example of that? Well, think about contemporary Aristotelianism. Aristotle says a lot of really boneheaded things about women and about laborers. And you're not going to find a lot of contemporary Aristotelians, many of whom are actually women, saying, yeah, Aristotle was dead on about that distinction that he made between men and women, saying that women were really just defective men and could never be fully rational, couldn't develop the faculties as well. This basic principle of gender difference in Aristotle is something that you, from the perspective, the broader perspective that an Aristotelian system provides you, you can say, we've got good reason to actually reject that one now. If Aristotle were around today, still working through his system, and you were to sit down with him at the bar, he'd probably say, yeah, I think that one I was a bit off. I was generalizing too much from the society that I was living in at the time.
Like what I said about human nature.
Looked a lot like that, and maybe I wasn't even right about that time, I have to sort of retrospectively think back to the women that I knew in 4th century BC and figure out whether I was actually correct. The point is that Hegel's getting at, if you want to refute a basic proposition, if you want to reveal the falsity in it, you have to do so by continually developing it. So you have to give it the benefit of the doubt, or to use the old proverb, give it enough rope to hang itself. You have to let it unfold so that you can then say, aha, here's where it's going wrong. We have to modify it. We have to reject it. It's showing itself as untrue. We could think of a few other examples of this as well. Take René Descartes. If you want to criticize Descartes' hyperbolic doubt
My partner
and
right
his reliance on that in the meditation.
Oof, that does not come out well in my feed. Whoops. Heh. I was hoping it would not do that. I might have to take this chatbot thing out. Oh gosh. You have to spread this thing out. Yeah. I guess the chat thing is not made to do what I'm trying to do. All right, I'll just leave it alone. Maybe I'll leave it like that. I probably won't get much chatting anyways, but thank you for coming to the stream.
And in some of his other works, which is really a key element of his system. Um, what you have to do is something along these lines. And this is actually what somebody like Charles Peirce did with Descartes. You have to go along with him. You can't just say, "Well, nobody really does doubt like that," or, "Well, in my system, we don't have to doubt along those lines because we believe in empirical reality." What you'd have to do is follow along with Descartes and out Descartes. You'd have to go along and say, you know, once you've opened up this can of worms with doubt, which is really acute. I mean, that's what's going on in the juncture between the first and the second meditation. He's got that metaphor of the slave, which is really quite important. It's overlooked. There's one of his weak points. If he can't pull off providing some sort of certainty after doing this hyperbolic doubt, then all you've got is doubt. And yet that can't be the case.
Hmm.
So if you go along with this, you can come up with reasons why, from an internal Cartesian perspective, there might be something hinky with this idea of doubt and its resolution that Descartes has. But you can only do that if you do the work of developing that within the system. You can't just come out from the outside and say, well, I don't believe in doubt like that, or that's no good for me, because that's not really a response, not a valid response, according to Hegel. So he says, the refutation consists in the further development of the principle and in remedying the defectiveness if it did not mistakenly pay attention solely to its negative action, without awareness of its progress and result on their positive side too. It turns out maybe sometimes with these basic propositions we say, well, we're assuming that they're true, but then they're going to show up to be false. But maybe they actually, within the system, they turn out to have a deeper truth to them.
Mm.
You know, let's use another example. Is there such a thing as human nature? And if so,
Let's see. Let's see what he said.
is it social? Or are we primarily asocial and then have to be socialized?
Mm.
So you could say with somebody like Aristotle.
Well, let me make some predictions because I love this topic here. I've been reading a lot into like anthropology and archaeology and all this other stuff, sociology, psychology, all the ologies, and some interesting stuff I found, in which for some reason a lot of people don't like to. Well, I know why. It's because people don't like to believe in free will, right? But there there's a strong materialistic, I mean materialistic as in the material physical world, like the environmental conditions. There's a strong materialistic cause to human nature, right? The best you can say about human nature is that it adapts to its environment, at least from what I've seen so far. However, its environment is not just a ecological one, right? It's not just a geographic area that you're in and the stuff that happens there. That's just one level. That's the foundations, right? Of whatever is going to um, what's going to come next, right? The environment builds the foundation, yeah, for your social environments, right? The social environments are what you create based on the incentives or the various conditions, the resources available, whatever, right? Your social environment is created based on how you respond, how we adapt to the ecological environment. And then the social environment itself has multiple layers, right? There's your family unit. Um, there's the individual, what you're thinking in your head. You have that level of your environment, your psychology, if you will. Then you have your sociology, which is of course how you interact with all the different people that's also in that space. Um, And from there, you have things like culture, which is basically your social environment, but over a span of time, over a long period of time. Um, then you have your, you can have things like your religion, your belief systems, your politics, your economy. All these other are like stacked. They're stacked on top. These are all the different types of environments in which we're responding to. Right. So if you take all this into consideration, then you can more clearly see human nature. People love to say, oh, humans are inherently greedy or inherently violent or whatever. But when you look into history, you see that no, there's some societies that are fundamentally way more peaceful, than what we have today. There are some societies that are fundamentally way more egalitarian than our current societies today. Fundamentally, as in they teach this from a young age, and I've spoken about this many times before. For instance, how they would, raise their kids to be, to be able to make choices which breast you want to get your milk from when you're 2 weeks old. By the time you're a couple months, how to share your toys and stuff like that. By the time you're a year old, 2 years old, how to start making your own food. So from the fundamentals of these societies, they've structured your environment such that their human nature, right, their natural behaviors are done a certain way is different than how that might play out in a different environment with a different culture and a different set of values. So human nature is not some objective thing. The most objective thing about human nature is just that it's adaptable. And that's my prediction. Let's see what he says though.
Aristotle, man is a social animal, right? That's a basic proposition, which he spends quite a bit of time working out the ramifications and implications of, but doesn't really bring to a complete conclusion because he hadn't seen all the societies of the time. He did quite a comprehensive review. Unfortunately, we've lost most of what he wrote on that, all these constitutions.
Mm,
Um,
interesting.
but maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was wrong to think that our nature is inherently social, that the political community is something that is natural to us. Do we then swing over to the other extreme and become, say, Hobbesian individualists or individualists of other stripes? No, not necessarily, because maybe he's right on a deeper level.
Mm,
Maybe if you actually work through Politics Book 1, you see that what he means by us being social animals is that we have the capacity to signify and to make present for ourselves moral values, and that the koinonia, the commonalities, the sharings in these are what bring us together. That this is in a certain way more basic than the notion of the polis.
mm.
That's a possibility, right?
A
I don't
strong
want to get too much
possibility.
into Aristotle here because we're talking about Hegel, but that would be an example of what he's talking about here.
I really gotta look up, Aristotle stuff. He keeps talking about it. Let me write this stuff down. Aristotle. What did it say? That politics or something like that. Politics of Aristotle. Politics one. Yeah. Okay. Just to keep that on my radar there. Sorry, I'm using Bing. I just figured I'd explore with Vivaldi. I've used it a while ago, but now that I have a new PC, I figured I'd try it again because it wasn't working very well on my Mac. It was just kind of slow. But anyways, let's go.
Um, so he says the genuinely positive exposition of the beginning is thus also just as much a negative attitude towards it. When we're working out the system and we have these beginnings in basic propositions, we are taking a negative attitude towards them by insisting that they be able to speak to us, that they be able to work themselves out, show themselves through examples, overcome whatever failings they seem to have, answer counter objections coming from the outside and be able to make sense of them, and weave themselves into the fabric of a system. We are treating them both positively and negatively at the same time. We are treating them as both false and true at the same time by weaving them into a system of truth.
Hmm.
That the true is actual only as system, or that substance is essentially subject, is expressed in the representation of the absolute as spirit,
Mm,
the most sublime notion, and the one which belongs to the modern age and its religion.
mm. So the absolute as spirit, and by that I guess he means the absolute, like the universe or everything there is, right? Or he might mean a more religious more religious idea of the divine God as spirit, as consciousness, as thought. Um, Interesting representation of absolute spirit. Yeah, and the most sublime notion, and the one which belongs to the modern age and its religion. Yeah, notion was like just the kind of current day understanding or the shape of knowledge in that time, if I remember correctly.
as spirit, the most sublime notion, and the one which belongs to the modern age and its religion. The spiritual alone is the actual, its essence or that which has being in itself. It is that which relates itself to itself and is determinate. It is other being and being for self.
Mm,
And in this determinateness, or in its self externality, abides within itself. In other words, it is in and for itself.
mm. Spiritual alone is the actual. It is essence. It is essence, or that which has been, it is essence, or that which has being in itself. It is that which relates itself to itself, and is determinate. It is other being and being for self, and in this determinateness, or in its self externality, abides within itself. In other words, it is in and for itself. That's a lot of itself there. But basically, like is self describing, and that's why you have to when you make an argument, you describe it with other ways of looking at what it is, you know, and that negation, looking at what it's not, in order for you to better reflect or better understand what it is that you're trying to understand, what you're trying to explain and understand and like have knowledge of, I guess.
But this being in and for itself is at first only for us, or in itself. It is spiritual substance. It must be also this for itself. It must be the knowledge of the spiritual, and the knowledge of itself is spirit. That is, it must be an object to itself. But just as immediately as a sublated object reflected into itself,
Hmm.
it is for itself only for us, insofar as its spiritual content is generated by itself. But insofar as it is also for itself, for its own self, it is self generation, the pure notion, is for it the objective element in which it has its existence, and it is in this way, in its existence for itself, an object reflected into itself.
Hmm.
The spirit that so developed knows itself as spirit.
I feel like you wanted to just play around with these words of self and existence. Like, how many times can you flip it? It's like a when a rapper, uses the same phrase over and over again, just to see how much they can flip it in different ways. It's like a just want to flex a little bit. I feel like he's kind of doing a little bit of that there, but it's a good point. It seems it is for itself only for us, insofar as its spiritual content is generated by itself. So like we can understand, the consciousness or an idea for what it is only because of, we're thinking about what it is, it's being like when we think of a concept, you know, the concept is almost like the concept has a life of its own, right? Has its own separate thing in which it's trying to communicate with it or kind of understand it and just I don't know how to explain that, but it's kind of a trippy feeling, almost like ideas have a life of their own type of thing. But insofar as it is also for itself, for its own self, this self generation is the pure notion is for it the objective element in which it has its existence. Right? It's kind of self-evident, self-objective, and in this way, it is existing for itself, and the object reflected into itself. Yeah, I'm telling you, man, he was just trying to flex here.
Spirit is science. Science in its actuality, and the realm which it builds for itself in its own element.
Mm.
And the realm which it builds for itself in.
The science is its actuality, and the realm which it builds for itself in its own element. Mm. The ability to kind of like explain something, to build that, you know, those building blocks of understanding allows us to create a realm for any concept, any idea, and that idea, because we're building this for itself, it's like a monument to an idea, right? Where you're like, okay, I understand what this idea is, and now I have this whole system, right? This whole science around this one concept, and it's very. I know he probably wasn't saying it this way, how I'm saying it, but I found it's very interesting interpretation. Like we build monuments to ideas and concepts by studying them, and creating like this science and systems around them. I don't know. It's kind of trippy.
Its own element. In section 25, we've now arrived at a really critical juncture where Hegel is laying some cards on the table and showing us the absolute idealism
Mm,
that he is endorsing. He says that all of what we've said so far, that the true is actual only a system, or that substance is essentially subject, these key ideas that he's been working out, that he's been exploring, that he's been arguing for, these are expressed in the representation, that's a key term that we're going to get back to, of the absolute as spirit. He goes on and he says, this is the most sublime notion and the one which belongs to the modern age and to religion. And those are really key, critical points as well. Let's actually dwell on that first,
okay.
right after we actually talk a little bit about what spirit means. And I
Yes,
suppose this is
please.
something where I should have brought this up from the beginning. So German has this term Geist, and that's why you're going to find more than one translation or more than one term used in the titles of these translations. This is called the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's also called the Phenomenology of Mind. And French has a similar term in esprit, which can mean spirit, and it can also mean mind, and it can actually also mean in French, it has a slightly wider significance, it can mean wit.
Hmm. Ooh, excuse
So
me.
mind or spirit, when we talk about the spiritual and the mental, they're not different things for somebody like Hegel. We tend to dissociate those in English, in part because we have different terms that we use for each of these.
Mm,
In German, it's the same term, and that allows an interesting interplay between the two of those. Same thing with French. Spirituality is not something that's completely divorced from the mental, so the notion of a purely affective spirituality is kind of a degenerate form for this way of looking at things.
hmm.
So, he says it's the most sublime notion, and here,
I wonder why there's this separation of, kind of spirit and mind as two different ideas in English as opposed to these other languages. I'm not a polyglot or anything like that. I don't really know the etymology or the kind of like the history of these different languages. That would be interesting to see if there's some sort of shared, branching based on religion. Um, I don't know. I have some theories. Maybe it's like a bunch of English has kind of been championed by Christianity or something like that, and they view kind of spirit as the part of the Holy Ghost type of thing, the Trinity or whatever. Whereas German, or you said French too. I think I don't know. I don't know. I might be completely off, but I want to look that up because that seems very interesting.
notion in the term of the concept. It's characteristic of the modern age. Now you might say, what the hell modern age is Hegel talking about? Sure isn't ours. Well, Hegel is writing at a time where it looks like a lot of progress has been continually made. You've got to remember the French Revolution is still, for all practical purposes, ongoing at the time that he's.
It's so interesting because once again, mentioned this before when Hegel was first talking about this. It's like every age, people think they're in the modern age. Like it's kind of trippy to remember. Like today we call this the modern age, but in 100 years, people like what was that? This is primitive, or 200 years, or 500 years, or something like that, right? Aristotle, he was in the modern age of his time. uh, and we have to remember that because sometimes we can make a mistake in thinking that we're at the apex of evolution, or like we're the destiny, or we're the destination rather. But we're just one process. We're just one part of this really long stream of life, and even if it ends here, like even if we have some apocalypse and we all die tomorrow, that still won't be the end. Like there's still going to be a whole lot of other life outside of us, and one day some other life form might achieve some sort of intelligence and you know dig up our skeletons and be like, oh, look at this primitive people. It's always just good, I think, to have that humility and remember that our time, no matter what time that is for you, is not it. Right? There's going to be more after you. Um, and it's probably going to be true until the end of time, which is trillions upon trillions of years, in advance, and then there might be, eternity. There might be some new universe that pops up and it all starts all over again. I don't know, but just that's just good stuff to keep in mind, I think.
He's writing this. Um, Europe has been developing and developing and developing. The masses now actually have the possibility of a life that won't just be misery and
Mm,
ignorance and bigotry and superstition. The Republic of Letters has been established, and it's still ongoing even through the Napoleonic Wars.
Republic of Letters.
There's this conception that he's got of history as reaching a sort of culmination point where the spiritual, where the ideal, where the mental becomes more important and explicitly more important than the merely corporeal or physical,
Mm.
or purely economic, or purely, pick whatever you like, purely pragmatic. So that's something that he sees as characteristic of modernity. Not all of modernity, but it becomes a real live possibility in the modern age.
And we see that still today, right? Where people want a sense of purpose, right? People want to belong to something bigger than themselves. And it turns out, this is why I really love, psychology and positive psychology specifically, but it turns out that there is no hierarchy of needs. Like hierarchy of needs is like when Hegel, I mean, goodness, when Maslow was writing his hierarchy of needs, he didn't actually mean it as a pyramid. He didn't mean it to say as the bottom you have to achieve this and then this. It's not like a video game with levels. It's more like an open world skill tree, right? Where yes, you can start with some core skills, but you can also kind of jump to these other levels, and it depends on where you start and who you are that determines where that you start in that space, like kind of like Path of Exile with their crazy skill tree, and you can start at any point and then move to any other point. That's kind of like how our hierarchy of needs are, you know. So the quote unquote basic needs of needing food, shelter, safety, all that other stuff. Yes, it's basic in the sense that it's foundational. Like if you have these things, it will make it easier to have a positive experience with the other things like purpose and all these other things. If you don't have them, it makes it harder to achieve to have a positive version. But if even if you don't have all these things, you can still have a sense of purpose or a sense of you know um, belonging or whatever. And in fact, in some in societies like uh, he Maslow studied like the Blackfoot folks or many other types of hunter-gatherer societies, for instance. They start with the sense of purpose, right? And they look at life as like a game, um, as a very fun thing to do, where it is an infinite journey. And because of that, that inherent sense of purpose, they can better, do things like hunt and gather and do art and all this other stuff, because it's for them the basics is the purpose, and then they go from there. So it really depends on the type of society you have. But I went way off the mark off on a tangent here, but I just again I find that one as something super interesting to think about. Is like sometimes you don't need to start where you think you want to start, like with the most basic things. Sometimes you need a sense of purpose first in order for you to even feel motivated enough to want to care about basic needs like food and water and shelter and all this other stuff. Like sometimes you need a sense of purpose first. um so anyways.
It's also something that is associated with religion, spirituality. Why? Because religion, for Hegel, is how we approach the absolute, that which transcends us and encompasses us, and perhaps even redeems us and guides us towards a greater amount of being what we are, reveals to us our true purposes. All of that.
I know I'm pausing a lot. I haven't paused too much earlier, so let me get my stuff off now. Turns out, once again, if you when you look into psychology, um, everybody needs a sense of purpose, right? Everybody needs a to believe in something bigger than themselves, and they've studied this many times across many cultures, across many time periods, where people who don't believe in something bigger than themselves tend to be more egomaniac, like egotistical, or more depressed, right? It seems to be a basic, a quote unquote basic human need, right? Where that's what I meant by the hierarchy of needs. It's like all of them are needs. It's not like some are needs and some are privileges. No, all of them are needs. Like you need a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of self-esteem, as well as safety. Um, and religion, I think the reason why religion has always been such a huge thing with people is because we inherently need to have that sense of something bigger, right? Whatever comes with this evolution of intelligence, this sentience, also comes with it a desire to understand, to look beyond, where we are now, and to try and grasp the sky, to try and understand, where the stars and all this other stuff that's way bigger than us, and try to, make some sense out of it. And with that comes a spiritual experience. Maybe that also comes from psychedelics, because it turns out a lot of our evolution seems to have been almost kind of prodded along with psychedelic experiences. But that's a conversation for another day. But either way, I think it's interesting to realize that religion is fundamental. Um, However, religion doesn't have to be religion. It's more about the spiritual experience, or I should say, the spiritual experience is fundamental, and that doesn't have to do with what book you believe in, or what specific rules, or life after death. Nothing. It's more about this feeling that you belong to something bigger, and that something bigger than you exists. Right? It doesn't have to be. You don't have to put a name on it. It could just be the universe, whatever that is. But pretty much every human, every healthy human, that wants to reach their biggest potential, needs to believe in something bigger than themselves. And I think it's an important part. That's an important aspect as to why religion is so big, and why even when people are trying to kind of step away from religion, they still need to believe in something bigger, right? But yeah.
That is spirituality, spirit working through the world. Now, I mentioned this term representation, and he's not going to dwell on this here. In German, it's Vorstellung, and this is going to turn out to be a really important term when we get to talking about religion, which is the penultimate part of the phenomenology. Hegel thinks that religion is like one step short of philosophy. And in many respects, if we want to talk about other kinds of philosophy, it's one step short of his philosophy.
Mm.
And it's even better than a lot of philosophies available at the time. It gets to the heart of things. It gets to the real, true essence of things more reliably than other modes of thought, other modes of being. But it doesn't go all the way. It's penultimate for Hegel. And it's penultimate because it works through representations. One of the thrusts, the constant criteria and measures for the phenomenology is, are we still working with a representation, or have we arrived at the point where we have conceptual knowledge?
Mm.
We want conceptual
Interesting.
knowledge from Hegel's perspective, not just representations, because representations, although they're very important steps and they are progress, are still
It's not the
contingent.
thing itself. Yeah.
They're culturally conditioned. They are focused in certain respects, and they can sometimes mislead us.
Mm.
So Hegel will say the spiritual alone is the actual. Only the spiritual is truly real. The material, the humdrum, day-to-day, corporeal, pragmatic, it's not to say that that's not real, but it's given its real meaning, its truth, by the spiritual,
Hmm.
by what lurks behind it, by what inhabits it and breathes life into it. So he says the spiritual alone is essence, or that which has being in itself, but it's also that which relates itself to itself. So that makes it being for itself as well
Mm.
as being in itself. We've talked a lot about this process, so I'm not going to draw more circles or spirals or write reflection on the board one more time, because that's all sort of built into this notion of for itself. He says it is that which relates itself to itself. So remember this process of mediation, of splitting, of doubling, becoming other to itself is part of that. Because of this, it is determinate. That's a key thing that I will put on the board. Spirit takes on determinacy. Here's why Hegel would actually reject people who say, yeah, I'm spiritual, but I'm not really religious. That whole notion there. It's too vague. As a
Mm.
matter of fact, spirit can be political, spirit can be legal, spirit can be artistic, but spirit takes place through determinacy. It's not just something abstract. It becomes other. It becomes for itself by being something determinate. So, for the ancient Greeks, the realm of spirit is going to take place in part through their sculpture, in part through their plays, in part through the organization of democratic polities and the fight against the oligarchs and the revelation that the democracy.
Yeah, this is a good point too, and this is something I didn't touch on, but yeah, that's something I like. If you read the book Self Actualization, or the New Science of Self Actualization by S.B. Kaufman, this is where I'm getting a lot of my ideas of um, the hierarchy of needs, or rather the integrated and revised hierarchy of needs, is that believing something bigger than yourself. It doesn't have to be just religion. It could be anything. The problem is that when it's based on something that is inherently based on, like, people call it tribalism, right? Of this in and out group type of ideology, then that could lead to something kind of negative in terms of your behaviors and your mechanisms. Like if you believe in, like I said, there's politics and different things. Um, yes, it is something bigger than yourself, but you're going to be very like a very much like a zealot in terms of your acceptance of people, right? Like if somebody doesn't believe in your politics, that's the same thing as somebody not believing in your God or something like that, right? So you have to be careful in where you place that belief and what you place that in. So yeah, I agree. It can be determinate, or it should be determinate. Um, it kind of has to be, because if you don't, I said before, you don't have to put a name on it, but he's right in that if you don't put a name on it, like, it becomes too vague. Like you can say, oh, you can be very wishy washy with what you actually believe in, what you actually stand for, and when you're just going out and trying to figure things out, maybe you can get away with that. But it's almost always better to take a strong stance and say, I believe in this, right? But to change, right? To be open to change. But okay, I believe in this now, but then you matured and now you believe in something else. What's the term? Strong beliefs loosely held. I think that's a very strong term, an idea for this. Like you can and probably should believe in something very strongly, but also be open to changing, and to not be so bullheaded about these
Actually
things.
can lead to tyranny and empire on the part of the Athenians. Um, all of that is part of spirit, and all of that is determinate. So we actually have to pay attention to real things and find the greater hidden associative meaning that they possess.
Mm.
We have to see the spirit working through them, Hegel would say. That's all part of spirit being for itself. Spirit posits itself to be more than just being in itself. So then he says, um, in this determinateness, or in its self-externality, it abides within itself. In other words, it is in and for itself. It's not just being in itself, not just being for itself. It is also the unity or the fusion of those two. Here's where it gets really, really interesting.
Keep going.
Then he says, this being in and for itself is at first only for us, or in itself. It is spiritual substance. It must be also this for itself. It must be the knowledge of the spiritual and the knowledge of itself as spirit. It must become object to itself, but just as immediately reflected into itself. It is for itself, only for us. So this for us, that I put an exclamation point after, shows up twice. Its being in itself is also its being for us. The development of spirit, of God, however you want to put it, through history, through human agency, is for us, the human beings that are actually observing and perhaps even wondering at this process. Spirit's dynamic activity, its own reflection into itself, is also what it is because it's for us.
Mm.
We are part of the process. A lot of times people get turned off by Hegel because they think, yeah, we're all just like, moments in the process. Our individuality doesn't really matter. Here's a more optimistic view on this. No, we do matter, and not just as single nodes to be, sublated or washed away or, overcome in our identity. Spirit matters because it exists for us.
Hmm.
Otherwise, let it happen all over there. It exists for us. Now, that doesn't mean that, we can just approach it uncritically and without expecting to be transformed ourselves in the process, that, we're qualified right off the bat to pass immediate judgments on this whole process or its plausibility. But it does mean that we're being invited to join in the dance, so to speak. So he says,
Joining in the dance. I love that.
insofar as it is also for itself, for its own self, this self-generation, the pure notion, is for itself the objective element in which it has its existence, and in this way, it's an existence in itself, is an object reflected into itself. That the spirit that's so developed knows itself as spirit. How does it know itself as spirit? Partly through this entire process that has preceded us, where spirit has become conscious of itself, partly through us in the present,
Mm.
partly through Hegel, partly through us. So he says, spirit so developed knows itself as spirit. That's how it becomes science. Science in its actuality has to be spirit. Put into another way, in order for philosophy to truly become knowledge, to truly become science, to truly become what Hegel's calling Wissenschaft, a sort of systematic, disciplinary, rigorous form of knowing, it has to do so through coming to know itself. There is no such thing for Hegel as spiritless science.
Mm. No such thing as spiritless science. Ooh, buddy, that was good. That was a good one. Oops, it's still playing. Went to the next one. But yeah, telling you, man, it's a great preface, great book. I do want to work through this faster, but I'm working now, so it's even harder to make sure I do this every Thursday. So, but I'll figure something out because I do want to, eventually get to the actual chapters of this book. I think it's up to like 700 videos, so I'm gonna be at this for a couple years. But hopefully, one of these days we can just push through a whole bunch of them at the same time. Thank you, baby. She said so wonderful. Uh, Kind of low energy today because I'm really tired. A lot of work, but I really wanted to do this because I missed last week's. Um, but yeah, it was great, and thank you, my sweet baby, for coming to my stream. And for you all that's watching this today or later in a week or later in a month, year, decade, whatever, please put in the comments what you thought about this. Um, Feel free to reach out to me what you thought about this, and yeah, learn alongside me if you want to learn. I kind of see this as like a classroom type of thing where we're all like in our little classes, and we're working together and try to learn together and stuff like that. I think that's really cool, with our professor Sattler here. um, but yeah,